I guess you can control it, but that's where supply chain is have your backup plan. Did you save during the good years? Be ready for all that kind of stuff. So try to. I think it probably felt more homesick when I moved away.
How much or how big of an impact did going to university, leaving Sitsil have for you?
Yeah, I think it has a huge impact. I think I would recommend anybody that's going to school to probably not just be like an hour or two away, but like.
Thank you for joining us on the Growing Life podcast.
It would mean the world to us if you could just follow us on Spotify, Instagram, and YouTube.
Stay tuned for more exciting episodes coming out every Friday.
With the stories of the past,
Shape your future with the Growing Life podcast.
When I was looking through your profile and all the various experiences you've lived and all the different companies you've been with, one thing that came across is I thought of the word adventurer. Adventure. Experiencing, going around the world, different companies, trying new things out, not being afraid, right? That's what an adventure is for me. I'm wondering if there's any moments in your childhood that resonate with that adventure spirit.
Yeah, that's a good question. I grew up in Sept-Îles, Quebec, so about 1,000 kilometers northeast of Montreal.
Yeah.
But even there, I was pretty lucky to have parents that we traveled. So, I was able to, in my youth, I had family in the States, so to go there, even to Montreal, but just like leaving your town and then eventually, going to Europe as well. And I think that just kind of put a first, instance of, there's more to this world than what I'm kind of growing up around. And I think that then followed me too, going to university. So university as well, there is no university in my hometown, so you have to leave. So already at 18, you're kind of like exposed to, there's a lot more out here than I thought or I knew. And I think that just kind of then snowballs into different parts of your life.
I'm wondering, what were those, how much or how big of an impact did going to university, leaving Sitsil have for you?
Yeah, I think it has a huge impact. I think I would recommend anybody that's going to school to probably not just be like an hour or two away, but leave. I think one, the independence that it kind of provides you or scares you or makes you realize how comfortable you are when you're back home. But at the same time, I think, we're much more resilient than we think. But at that age, you don't really have that many opportunities to test that resiliency, at least not positive types of resiliency. So I think those are really good opportunities to kind of stretch yourself, to be put in an environment that you're not familiar with and just be exposed to people, to ideas, that if you stay nearby, you're going to kind of be with people that you already think like you, that look like you, that are like you. And I think that was a big eye-opening thing of me going from Sept-Îles to Montreal already many, many years ago. I won't say when, but it's been a while.
Did you ever feel homesick? Because I know, speaking with some friends in university, some of them have really dealt with homesickness a lot, and it's been pretty tough on them. On my end, it's been a bit less difficult because I felt like I've mitigated that with just keeping myself so busy. So I don't know, have you ever experienced homesickness or even being away from home now, living in Seattle?
Well, when I was a student, I would say probably the first semester was the hardest because everything is new, depending if you're a resident or living in an apartment, that's a new kind of beat. You haven't really established your circle yet of friends and close contacts. You're kind of wondering, did I pick the right thing? So I think there's just a lot of questioning of oneself that happens in that first semester. After that, I would say school-wise, not really. You establish friends, you establish your new home base. If anything, when I would go back home to work or whatever, I'd be all right, I'm ready to go back. That's where my life is now. I think it probably felt more homesick when I moved away. So it happened, my first international experience working was in Paris. Again, you're kind of moving to a different country. Same language, same kind of standards of living and all of that, but still, it's not home. So there are moments that all of a sudden the distance feels real. And I would say probably the time that I found it the most difficult in my life was in Seattle. Not when I first moved here, it was during the pandemic. During the pandemic, I felt far from home. I felt stuck. I felt like I couldn't connect, and that was really really tough. That was probably the toughest time in my life. Was probably not even year one of the pandemic. I think it was year two, because year two it felt like this is going to last forever. When am I going to reconnect? When can I cross a border? All those things that we take for granted, all of a sudden felt a little bit unattainable at moments, and it was tough. So the second year of the pandemic was probably the toughest time in my career, in my life.
But like, it wasn't even as much as you couldn't go out and it was the restriction, but it was just like feeling as if your freedom, knowing that your freedom was restricted. It's not that you would have necessarily that specific day done anything different, like gone on vacation like for every single day, but just knowing that you couldn't if you wanted to, it had like such a huge mental toll.
Yeah, it definitely did. And, depending on your perspectives, all that, I was very much, I would say, at least at the beginning, very much a follower of the rules. And, where we didn't always have 100% of the information, how is it transmitted? How dangerous is it? Is it really that bad? And my parents now are a little bit older, so you're kind of worrying about if I go to see them, what kind of risk am I bringing? So those are definitely things that are in the back of your mind. But exactly to that point, it's not having the full decision yourself of being able to go or not, and that's what's probably made it the most difficult. It was the first time in my life that I felt that it wasn't on me, it was really being imposed on me. And all of a sudden, that's very different in terms of what it does to how you approach the situation.
Now in your career as someone working with the supply chain, I know it's a very serious business with a lot of risks. Do you see like the creativity aspect of the business?
Yeah, I think you have, it's creative in a different sense, right? You're not all of a sudden inventing a new mode of transport or a new way to create storage or things like that. But I think there are different ways that you can be creative in how you approach the business. And I think in supply chain, it's often a question of options and dollar signs or flexibility in front of those different options. And that's where the creativity from that field comes from. Saying, well, I can do this option, but it's going to cost you this much and it's going to arrive at this moment. I can do this option and do this and this, something hybrid. So it's really then a question of assessing risk, of knowing what the business is trying to do. So it's very important to be aligned with, what are the business objectives? Are we trying to grow fast? Are we trying to be profitable? Is it a mix of all those things? Is it, we don't really know. What does good look like? There's different moments in your career that you can be faced with that. So the creativity, I think, is the ability to understand a business objective, offer options that kind of respond to what it is we're trying to do. So it's not I would say the creative where we're gonna brainstorm and invent something that's completely revolutionizing the planet. But it's creativity in terms of what are my different options and really being an expert in a lot of fields that people don't really know, even in very mature organizations that you're listened to, you can influence quite a bit. And more, and we saw it during the pandemic as well, where all of a sudden supply chain, often we kid that supply chain gets spoken of when things go wrong. But at the same time, I think it puts a lot of limelight on what's going on and the different options and how being prepared, being flexible, and knowing what it is you're trying to do has a huge impact.
We were even laughing about it before prepping for this podcast. We were talking about the Suez Canal block and the ship got blocked, and how and how a small event like that had such a huge effect on supply chain.
Yeah, it really shows you that we take a lot of things for granted, and often it's you don't always want to be the thorn in the side when your supply chain, but already being able to kind of plan out or anticipate the what if scenarios. What if this happens? It doesn't mean it's going to happen, but when you're talking about probability and risk and things of that nature, it's like, well, what happens if the plant shuts down? What happens if all of a sudden I can't get my stuff? What happens if a country decides they're not going to trade with my country anymore? And all of those things, all of a sudden, well, how do I mitigate that risk in a cost-conscious way? So often the solution is complex. It's not simple. It's never black or white or binary. But how you kind of consider that and take risks at the right places that won't potentially shut down your business.
And back to the Suez Canal, has that impacted your line of work? Have you been more risk averse afterwards, taken less risk? Has it really changed how people working in the supply chain industry operate?
Sure. I think that one personally didn't impact me too much at that moment in time. Had impacts for some of the European markets and whatnot, but it's really more a question of when you see those problems arise. Sometimes you just have to be really reactive, understand your network. What can you do? How do you compensate? And sometimes you have to think that fundamentally, strategically, I have to change how I operate because this is a risk forever. Now, a boat that gets stuck in Suez Canal, like hopefully it's not going to happen every other week. So I
Yeah,
don't think that you'd want to organize your business around like what happens if canals block. But if there was a geopolitical situation or something that you can see could have an impact for multiple years, that's when you start thinking like, do I have to change my transport routes? Do I have to change where I'm making my production? Do I want to hold more inventory? And if I want to do all those things, can I afford it as a business? Because all those things have costs as well. So you're trying to mitigate versus what I want to strategically think about versus the other ones. I just want to have a capability where I can react and have plans B's and C's quickly if those ad hoc type of situations arise.
Right, and I know there's an ongoing shortage of computer chips and things like that. What do you think is the number one threat to the supply chain at the moment?
I think every supply chain will be a little bit different. That's definitely one that we saw is if demand is spiking. But again, the pandemic I think kind of accelerated some trends we saw, but like turbocharged it. So I think a lot of what we saw was just things that were going to happen over 10 years got turbocharged in 18 months in terms of a lot of sole sourcing from one country, in terms of what happens if demand spikes, very lean supply chains. Do we always want to be super lean on the critical parts? So how do you manage your risk, your basin of suppliers as well? So I would say, I think it just opened up a lot of the eyes, but I think those were questions that were being asked, honestly, even before that situation. And now it's a question of, well, what makes the most sense, right? Because again, for certain supply chains, it might be, I want to diversify. And let's look at how we can open up productions in other areas of the planet and have some stuff that maybe I can truck over a border or have it within country. Other places it might be like, no, I'm still going to really like zero in on cost efficiency at the max. And therefore my strategy I had before, still the right one. I just have to kind of be maybe a little bit more proactive if I'm starting to get signals that stuff might happen. So it really, again, it comes back to what it is we're trying to optimize for as a business.
I'm really wondering because you're speaking a lot about how supply chain is thinking about the alternatives. And that's something that we deal a lot with in school, where we have to consider different alternatives for case comps or situations that we have. But sometimes it's very difficult because you come up with your idea and it's yours, and there's like almost an ego thing going on there. So do you have any tips on how to step away, remove your ego, and really have an open mind at looking at all the possible alternatives and finding mitigations to those risks?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, even though my career, I've been specialized in supply chain and logistics, I try to think of myself more as a business manager, if you will, more than that happens to be specialized in that field versus the contrary. So, at the end of the day, I always try to put myself as the CEO. If I'm the CEO, like what's the best decision for the business? And not so much I'm trying to optimize for my particular part. And that takes trust that gets recognized. That takes trust in terms of your ability to convey that strategy or those different decisions. But that's always what's kind of helped me build my career over 2+ decades is that ability to be able to say, what's the right thing to do for the business? Now, that sometimes can be muddled by, sometimes it's not clear what we're trying to do for the business. Are we really customer first? Are we really trying to grow? Is it profit? All those different angles or dimensions that come into play. But as long as you get the alignment with, your peers, some of the senior leaders, then you can present the alternatives to optimize for whatever that is. So as long as you kind of remember, like your specific role, just take ownership for the totality of the business. Don't, of course, for your particular role, that's important. That's why you're hired. That's what develops your career. But at the end of the day, if you're able to take a step back and really look what makes the most sense for the business, it's not that difficult. I remember when I first started out, and in traditional business, so at this moment, I was still in the beauty industry, and e-com was starting to be a thing. Like, e-commerce, what are we going to do with this, and how's that? And I remember conversations with certain leaders that didn't think it was a positive thing, even though it was the most profitable way to distribute in a lot of different cases. Because why? Because the logistics costs per units were bad. So the KPIs looked bad. The more e-com orders you were doing, the more your KPIs would look bad. So that's like, yeah, if you're trying to optimize for your part and to really kind of pull on your part of the blanket, you might make good decisions for you, but you're making bad decisions for the business. So as long as you're transparent, you can explain that you're able to justify. Most of the time, if you do the right thing for the business, the decisions come pretty quickly or pretty easily, I would say, afterwards.
Yeah, you talk a lot about optimization and adjusting different aspects of the business. I'm really curious as to how do you kind of adjust these aspects? Do you do it on Excel, Google Sheets? Do you like run a simulation of the world? How does it go down?
Yeah, I would say most large companies have very sophisticated enterprise resource planning systems. So the SAPs of the world, if you will. So, usually as you get into the Fortune 500 type of scale, you'll have those complex systems that are very complete, very end-to-end, but are very cumbersome from a bureaucratic way. So sometimes it really depends too on where the company is on its maturity curve or where it wants to invest. Now, Excel, I think a lot of bosses and senior leaders like, we have to do everything in the system. Like no system can offer you the ultimate flexibility for every scenario, every ask. I think really what you're trying to do as a manager or even like an analyst in their own role is to say, can I do the heavy lifting, the redundant stuff in those systems, and then the exceptional ad hoc stuff, use Excel, Google Sheets, all those different tools that are available. So it's a mix. I would say if you're doing all of your planning on Excel, depending on the size of your business, that could be the right thing to do at that moment in time to not over-index or invest in IT solutions. But at one point, the question you're always asking yourself if you're growing is this scalable? So it's always kind of that thing where I have to invest now in my future. There might be no actual return on investment today, but in 5 and 10 years, yes. So how much do you believe in your business, in your P&L, to be able to make that investment today, even though it's maybe not the way you'd rather do it, because you know that in 10 years, it'll pay dividends. And sometimes that can be hard to justify or to kind of swallow that pill, if you will. But that's where you have to kind of manage, the short-term financial resource considerations versus, how confident are you in the business to be able to grow and to have it scale. That's a big thing that we're always trying to kind of weigh out and balance is that kind of today, how can you be efficient? How can you go quicker versus, but if I keep doing it this way in 10 years, I will crack under the pressure of unlinked tools and whatnot. So that becomes a conversation we're continuously having.
And sort of along those lines, we saw the huge rise in OpenAI, and now Microsoft is announcing Copilot to be implemented in Office 365. How is AI changing the way you're looking at supply chain right now, especially in terms of it being able to make its own decisions?
Yeah, I think that you hear about different pilots left and right. There's nothing I would say right now that's a tool that's recognized, even in companies in tech, saying like, this is going to take over and be able to really 100% optimize my supply chain from end to end. We're not there yet. So I think right now it's still this tantalizing tip of the spear type of moment that we're in. I think eventually it will help out. Now, the things I've seen in my career, not so much AI, let's call it machine learning, in terms of helping to produce demand plans, right? Demand plans, more and more, we have tons of data. How do you know what you're going to sell in 6 months, in 12 months? That's super tough. Even when you have like super competent teams, you have access to a lot of data, the interactions and knowing, how to weight everything in your considerations. And then, most of the time you're looking at it as a range, your low, medium, high, and what are the probabilities associated to it. So, we've seen some very tangible things where machine learning can help out on that front is to kind of take away the human I think or I feels and give you a starting point that's really, data driven. And then you can add the human intelligence on top of it. So while I think AI in 20 years, so hopefully at that moment I get to retire, the tail end of my career, it will be very vastly different. I think a lot of the redundant, cyclical type of stuff, data crunching, if you will, I think it will be very much AI led. But there will still always be that need for human intervention into those numbers because you don't know what you're going to do and your promo plans are changing and how your competition is reacting. We still have laws that govern what you can know in the market and what you can do. So that human intelligence or new categories of products that don't exist, we're not at a point yet where we can just turn the switch on to AI and check in on Friday. Yep, everything makes sense, kind of goes. So I think it's more of eliminating the redundant work, and then how do we layer human intelligence on top? And I think that combination, at least for the next decade and a half, is really where it's going to be interesting, is how do we make humans more efficient at what they bring value at versus trying to spend time at stuff that it's kind of a crapshoot in the middle.
And one thing that I was talking with Brandon, and we were, okay, well, at L'Oreal, okay, supply chain looks like this. You import the beauty products. At Microsoft, okay, the chips. How does supply chain look at a company like Meta?
Well, yeah, I think that's, for Meta, I work in a very special portion of it called Reality Labs, which is physical products. So when we're talking things like Quest and other products in our pipeline, very similar to any kind of consumer goods. Now, the technology is vastly different. The engineering, the use cases for it are very different. But again, when we come to the world of supply chain, everything can be broken down into different types of data. It's still a product. It's still a SKU. There's still demand for it. There's lead times to be able to build those things. There's a volatility of your demand. So what do you want your supply strategy to be? And then you have to bring it to the consumer. So you have to ship to partners or directly through e-com. So in a lot of ways, the products, I'm not trying to minimize the complexities of all the different industries, but there are certain commonalities and that's what allowed me to be able to go from the world of makeup and beauty to coffee to tech. It's not because all of a sudden, I've been able to pivot, at 180 degrees at each moment in my career. I was able to build a lot on the good stuff that I have, and fast moving goods has been around for 150 years. So a lot of the goodness and the best practices we've seen have come from that industry that tech can learn a lot from. And at the same time, those more traditional industries can learn a lot from how tech has grown so much in the last 20 or 30 years. So there's that kind of cross-pollination that becomes super interesting at that moment.
I know you've had a lot of responsibilities. You're carrying a lot of responsibilities. For me, I already feel like overwhelmed with all the schoolwork, my club participation, and don't feel like I can do much more on top of that. How have you balanced your responsibilities with your family?
Yeah, I think the first thing is the responsibilities. You don't go from 0 to 100 like in your career or even in your personal life. Like you add on, right? Because I think the real thing is finding your right mix and balance. And as your student lives, your personal lives, your professional lives, stuff will get added in, and your prioritization and your mix of those different elements will change. So I think the way is I think still bite off more than you can chew. I know that we talk a lot about you have to be comfortable and every person is different, but I think if you're going into business and you have a certain ambition and all that, like your limits are higher than you think they are. Like that's the first thing I would say is at the beginning it's overwhelming because you haven't been through that churn, that meat grinder in a certain way. But you find out pretty quickly that you're capable of a lot more. And I find too there's a forcing function that when you do a lot, you become a lot more optimized and you make the right trade-offs and you focus on what's really important. Whereas sometimes if you have like one task and you have a week to do it, you'll stretch it out, you'll go in a bunch of different directions, you'll fill the time with non-productive stuff. If you have 8 things you have to do and you have to start picking and choosing, all of a sudden your ability to focus on what's truly important, I find it's a skill that gets developed. So I'm not saying that it has to be like you have to be at 120 miles an hour, like every second of every moment. You have to be able to detach. But I would say that's then more a question of how you kind of put those pauses and those moments for you to kind of recharge, to have fun. Like at the end of the day, like all of this, it depends on your mentality. I work to live. I don't live to work. But, at that same moment, I have my own career ambition. There's certain things I want to do with my career that I still feel I have the energy, the ambition to do it. But how do you balance those things? But that's really one thing I would say is, you can do more than you think. And until you've tested yourself, you'll never really know. And 2, you'll be surprised how much more efficient that you become. And 3, being grounded with family and friends to kind of keep you grounded on real life, talk with people that aren't like you. Like if all of a sudden everybody you're around is working 90 hours a week, like find friends that don't, to kind of remind you that, this is maybe not the way to go, like for the next, 30, 40 years of your life a little bit. But, don't underestimate yourself, and if it feels like a lot, then yeah, take a pause, like recognize those moments but you'll know when you get there. And I guess everybody is different, so I don't think that applies to everybody. But for a lot of folks I've met in a lot of business fields, engineering fields, even medical fields and things like that, your limits are much more than you think they are. And don't underestimate yourself for that.
Yeah, it's even something as simple as going to the gym and you think you're at your last rep, but then you somehow find the strength out of nowhere to like do one more, right? And it's fascinating how our brains tell us like, no, that's it, you're done. But in reality, there's actually so much more you can do.
For a funny story on that, so during the pandemic, cabin fever, here in this exact room that I'm in right now, and spending way too many hours, a lot of work, especially like the first few months of the pandemic. And then at one point, it's like, well, if this lasts for 2 years, like, what am I going to do? Like, just work? So, but at the same time, I'm not so much on the workout side and all that kind of stuff. So how do I have another thing that I want to do? And I decided I'm going to do another master's for the fun of it, but in history this time. Was it the best decision of my life? Maybe not, but do I regret it? Not at all. And again, you find ways to optimize your time. You become efficient at my back to my student days. Like, what reflexes that I used to have that seem to work, and how do I layer in work and family and try to do all those things in a way that I feel that I'm doing those things well and I'm not dropping balls everywhere. And again, you make it work. Now, would I do that exact style of life for a decade? Not at all. But for 2 or 3 years, you'd be surprised how you can move stuff around, and all of a sudden you're like, man, I worked, I grew my career. My kids feel I'm present. My wife feels I'm present. And I was able to do a master's that's for me, that has nothing to do with my career, but that I was able to kind of do for myself and keep growing from that perspective. And it is possible. And if I told myself like, oh, that seems like too much work, dive in, like do it. You'll figure out a way. Like 90% of the time you'll figure out a way, and the 10% you'll learn from it. And next time you will be able to do it.
You seem like quite a resilient person. And recently at Meta, there's been a lot of layoffs, and also talk of Zuckerberg saying how managers are to take more actionable roles rather than leadership roles.
Sure.
How have you been dealing with these types of things at Meta? Is that a constant stress with all these layoffs happening?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I'm human, so I can't like put that completely to the side. Now, that being said, you try to kind of control what you control. Now, that's easier being said than done. A lot of different people will be in different situations. And this is, honestly, we're talking about Meta, but I have colleagues, past colleagues from Microsoft, Amazon that have been kind of through this churn. So this let's call it COVID era bubble right now is kind of popping when it comes to employment or whatnot. It's tough. What I've appreciated from Meta, their strategy was, one, the transparency. Like, don't paint a rosy picture if it's not rosy from that perspective. That helps. That doesn't make, how you're feeling and whatnot go away. Two is I'll focus on what I can control. Am I taking my foot off the pedal in any way? No, but that's my personal choice. I believe in the business unit that I'm in. I believe in the company as well. And I think that's kind of helped me focus a little bit. And that too, just talk about it. I talk with my wife, with friends about my stress, what I'm feeling, with colleagues, with my team, so the people that report directly into me, and with my manager as well. There's never any guarantees or anything like that, but know yourself. If it feels like it's a lot, take half a day, go walk. I've done that over the past month. I'll take a day because I feel like I need to unwind and unplug a little bit, because it becomes a lot. You have the work and then you have the stress. Don't ignore it. Don't pretend it doesn't exist. That's true too, as you're managing a team, is don't like paint rosy pictures if that's not the case. Now, that being said, is people feed off your energy. If I go in and moping and being sad and victimization, all those things, I'm not doing the team any service at that moment in time. But we'll talk about it. We'll focus on what we control. We'll make sure the deliverables that we do have is there. And, we'll try to keep the energy up. That's it. I've been fortunate in my career that I haven't had to live these experiences too often. But they do happen. And I think, anybody that's been around long enough that economic cycle is going to happen in every industry. And sometimes it's a little bit more acute than other instances. I guess you can't control it, but that's where supply chain is have your backup plan. Did you save during the good years? So, be ready for all that kind of stuff. So try to apply some of that supply chain knowledge that I've had over the last 2 decades into my personal life as well. So that way you can kind of absorb the shocks should they present themselves. So, in terms of the other part of your question for managers and taking on more, I think it's a fair reflection that the meta leadership is there when you're growing really, really quick, because that's what the priority was capture the opportunities, grow quick. And all of a sudden, if you see a change in that trajectory is, how we built ourselves, the organization, is it the right one for where we are now? And of course, it sucks. Like if it's impacting you, it's gonna not be a pleasant thing. But again, take a step back. What are we trying to optimize for? Does it make sense? Yes. Have that in the back of your mind, and then of course, deal with your personal life and if there's any consequences. But don't hold any ill will or all those things. Don't dwell on the negativity. Just really focus on what you can control and try to understand what's going on. And I think that helps a little bit, at least, to be able to deal with these situations.
Well, we have a tradition for our podcast where at the end we ask our guests their thoughts on a quote. And this quote came from our previous guest, which is an entrepreneur. And the quote is, "Look for what you see, but nobody else notices."
Ooh,
what are your thoughts on that?
That's awesome. I really like that. I'm trying to find a way to react. I think it's spurning like the right neurons in my brain. So that's a good quote then. I think it's, maybe I'll translate that for how I'm thinking about it in a very boring supply chain way. But it's like, where do you bring value, or where do you see the value in things? And I think a lot of times what I've seen in organizations is people hesitate to speak up when they see things. They hesitate to feel that they can contribute something as well, no matter where they are on their career trajectory. It's like, if you see something, speak up, like in terms of efficiencies, ideas. Often if you're thinking about it, maybe nobody else has that idea in the room and you can bring it up. And if it was a bad idea, you'll learn why it was or why the context wasn't right. And sometimes you'll have those aha moments. I think that's like kind of the risk-taking aspect of it, of that I feel that people in their career, like, we're too cautious. Like there's something about like in careers that we're this fear of like, oh, I'm going to say the wrong thing. I'm going to do the wrong thing. And yet for a lot of organizations, it's like, take intelligent risks. And if you make a mistake, oops, we'll learn from that. Like most most organizations that are forward-looking, growth-oriented and all that will actually value that quite a bit. And I think having that mindset, and it's a skill to develop right at the beginning of a career. It's like, go in and speak up, share your ideas, be enthusiastic, question, challenge. And if you're seeing those things and you're looking at those opportunities, I think bringing them up is the way to kind of go on that. So I guess that's how I would think about that quote, but really good quote.
Awesome. Thank you so much for coming on, and we've really enjoyed this conversation.